We've taken 12 weeks this autumn to work through the Apostle John's first letter. In it, John has warned of the dangers of false teachers, those who deny the truth about Jesus being the incarnate God, and he has encouraged his readers to love in word and deed, as real Christians everywhere should do. John's second and third letters are much shorter, and we're going to take just a single sermon to look at each of those two letters. John 2 this week, John 3 next week. They are much more like the kind of letters that we might send today. They're like many New Testament era letters. The sender puts their name at the top, not the bottom of the letter. Think of that kind of like letter-headed notepaper. You often find the name of the sender at the top. And that's like this letter. But in this case, John isn't actually using his real name. He's using his title, the term elder. As he refers to his children, to his readers as children, we can see here that there is almost certainly an age gap between John and his readers. But there's more than that. There's clearly a relationship of great affection. John is their teacher, and they are learners from him. John is their spiritual father, and they are his sons and daughters in the gospel. What an encouragement for us this morning as we seek to strengthen Spen Valley Church together, as we think through how we teach others in the gospel, that we too, like John, can have spiritual children in the gospel. Because being a Christian changes how we behave, it changes not just what we believe, but also makes a difference to our lives. When we follow Jesus, we have different priorities, different goals for our lives. John's example for us here is to invest our lives in relationships. Be like John. Invest your time in teaching and mentoring other people in the truth. The big theme of this letter is that truth matters. And we'll see shortly how it both unites and also divides. But before we do so, I want us to see a very specific and particular truth that brackets this letter. It's there both in verse 1 at the start and also verse 18 at the end. And if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it. But let's not, because this is a really important concept. So our first point today is chosen for truth. Chosen for truth. Right at the beginning of this letter, just after he's announced his name, in verse 1, John tells us who the letter is being sent to. To the lady chosen by God and to her children. Now, at first glance, you might think that John is sending this letter to an actual female and that her family of biological children are with her, which might possibly be what it means. But the reference to a lady might well be something else. Now, Graham and I have been taking our John through the church membership and baptism material in the past few weeks. And the other day, we were looking at all the different pictures that the New Testament uses for a church. And it has lots of different ways of describing the church. As a body, as a household, as a family of believers. And so it is quite likely here that when the Apostle John writes chosen lady, he's actually using that phrase as a picture of a local church. And the phrase her children as a reference to the members of that church. This is reinforced by how he signs off the letter back down there in verse 13. The children of your sister, who is chosen by God, send their greetings. The sister would be John's home church, whose members are sending their greetings via John's letter to the church of the lady who's receiving it. we probably should consider that John is writing to a church, as his statements of love for the lady in verses 1 and 2 and his encouragement to love in verse 5 make much more sense in a church context, just like he wrote in his first letter. Isn't that a wonderful picture of the family of God? To think of it as the local church members as offspring of the church. Well, whether you accept that the lady is a church with members or an actual mother with biological children who follow in the faith, what can't be disputed is the term that John is using to describe them, and he uses it both in verse 1 and in verse 13 to bracket the letter. Chosen by God. The members of the church are chosen by God. Some translations have that as the word elect. We know what elect means because we elect our members of parliament. We choose them from a pool of candidates in a local election, in a general election. And this is the same thing. Elect means to choose. God chooses his followers. The Bible isn't shy about proclaiming that God chooses his followers. It's a very prominent thing in the New Testament. Let me give you just a couple of references so you can understand that. So in Romans chapter 8, verses 29 and 30, that says this: For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that Jesus might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So there's a very clear statement there that God chooses the members of the church. Paul also mentions it in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Paul there states, For God chose us in Jesus before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Christ Jesus in accordance with his pleasure and will. Very, very clear, bold headline statements. God chooses his followers. Being elect, being chosen by God, it isn't just a New Testament thing. It's there throughout the history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 2, Moses records these words: For you are a people holy to the Lord. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. John Currid, in his commentary on that passage, points out the Hebrew word for chosen never, ever carries any suggestion that any characteristics on the part of the elected person were a factor in that choice. Thus, Yahweh's choice of Israel is not based on her greatness, on her size, on her beauty, or on anything else about her, because she was none of those things. It is the unmerited election of Israel by God through his sovereign grace. Let's not be squeamish about this truth, and nor should we be embarrassed about it. It is an amazing truth, and we should rejoice in it. What was true about the nation of Israel thousands of years ago is also true about you and I, if we are Christians. There is nothing that we can bring, there's nothing that we need to bring to the party. It's the exact opposite of a job interview. Think about applying for a job where the employer sees dozens, perhaps hundreds of applications from candidates and sifts them and then interviews a few of them based on their skills and experience. And then finally they pick the candidate who brings the most complete set of capabilities to do the job. Well, God does the exact opposite. God goes out and chooses worthless nobodies with nothing to recommend them, and then he lavishes his grace on them. Why is this good news? It's good news because it means that nobody is excluded. You can't be too bad. You can't be too evil for God. God excels in taking lost, broken, disillusioned people and saving them to a relationship of abundant life and purpose in his Son Jesus. Maybe you're listening today, perhaps in the room, perhaps on YouTube, and you've written God off because you think you're not religious enough for him, or you think you don't qualify in some other way to be part of God's people. Well, that simply isn't true. Jesus said, I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. You don't have to earn acceptance with God. Jesus offers it to you as a free gift when you turn from your rebellion and come to him for forgiveness. Is it finally time to stop running and start facing up to the reality that God is calling you to reckon with him? And when we trust Jesus and receive from him the gift of salvation, we join a community of people united in the truth of the gospel. And so that's our next point. Not only truth chosen for truth, but secondly, truth that unites. Truth that unites. You don't have to read very much of John's letters to understand that truth matters to John. It's all through his first letter, and it's still here in his second letter. John wrote his first letter, which is much longer, to warn against false teachers and to remind his readers of the truth that they have known from the beginning. Here in John's second letter, in verses 1 to 3 of his introduction, he mentions truth 4 different times. He says that he loves his readers in the truth. He tells them that all who know the truth love each other. Verse 2 explains that for those who truly believe, truth always lives within us. Verse 3 is a greeting in which John says the salvation with which we are saved is present in truth and love. All this provides a great backdrop to John's first priority, which is for his readers and for us to walk together in truth. Don't let there be a difference between the truth that lives within you, verse 2, and the way that you walk in the world. We need to be people of integrity, people of the book, people for which a right understanding of truth matters. John here twice spells out for us in verse 4 and in verse 6 that the Father commands that we walk in obedience. Of course, this isn't to be some cold, dutiful adherence to rules and regulations. To love the Lord is to want to obey him in every detail. So we warmly obey. We do it willingly, or at least we should do. Back in his first letter, in chapter 4 and verse 19, John assumes we do that. We love, he says, because he first loved us. He says to love God and to want to obey him is a natural response to the love that God has shown to us. And so if God has chosen you, even though you didn't have anything to merit that, even though you were worthless. If God has chosen you and God has lavished his grace upon you when you didn't deserve any of that either, when you weren't worthy of being chosen, don't you think that responding with willing obedience is the right response? You can prove the genuineness of your love for Jesus by obeying his teaching. Love is the fulfillment of the law, and there is no greater command than this. Nor is there any better joy to be found. Do you want joy in your life? Do you want to find meaning and purpose for your life? The path to a fulfilling life, a life of worth and satisfaction, is to obey Jesus. Although sin can and does offer short-term pleasures, sin always comes with a sting in the tail. To choose to sin is to choose to suffer. That's why John urges us to obey and to walk in love. So throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles you. And of course, obedience and love have a context. This letter is written to a community, not to individuals. We love God together. We love one another. It's hard to love on your own. You can, of course, say, I love that sunset, or I love how brilliantly Bill Bailey dances on Strictly. You could even say, I love the taste of hummus. But that's not really love, is it? Real love needs a somebody else to love. It needs an object. It needs another human to be the recipient of the love. Somebody who's capable of loving us back. And the best love of all is not just the words, but actions. As we love and serve our fellow believer, and as they love and serve us back, our actions help authenticate our gospel message. It's not for nothing that Jesus says, as recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 13 and verse 35, by this, by loving each other, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So obeying truth together, loving and walking together in that truth, just as Jesus commanded, verses 5 and 6 of our passage, is best for us because it builds a caring community. And that is the best advert for the power of the gospel as a skeptical world watches on. So how can you better love and serve your fellow member of Spen Valley Church? That was the truth that unites. And now John changes tack. And so next we have truth that divides. Truth that divides. In verse 7, John repeats a warning that we previously read in his first letter, that some false teachers have been at work in the church. He calls them deceivers, and says explicitly that they do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh, the main warning and hallmark of false teachers, as we learned in 1 John chapter 4. Because they deny Jesus as truly God, John brands them all as the Antichrist. And so here in verse 8, John tells his readers to watch out that you do not lose what you have worked for. Do we see the balance John is striking here? Because some would try and tell us that true love is to accept other people, differences and all. It's not very loving to tell someone who thinks differently from you that they're wrong, is it? So we should all become very tolerant of each other's views and be supremely loving to everyone, whatever they believe. Isn't that true love? Except that isn't true love at all. That's actually a postmodern redefinition of it that says love tolerates everyone's version of the truth because, well, that's true for them. And who are we to say otherwise? But John knows the lie of postmodernism. And he warns us here. Just because he's been telling us to love one another, that doesn't mean that we are to accept anything anyone says as the truth. It is vitally important that our love is based on truth. And truth is absolute. And so John urges here for his readers to watch yourselves. Be discerning of falsehood and don't believe it. Complacency is perhaps the biggest danger for us, especially for us in our, relatively speaking, comfortable Western lives. Maybe that's one of the benefits of the current difficult circumstances. Our society's Western secular dream has been really badly shaken by the ravages of COVID-19. But my prediction is, next year, just watch how quickly people sink back into complacency and comfort as the vaccines are rolled out and life starts to return to some semblance of normality in 2021. People will very quickly turn back to filling their lives with trivialities again. We must take John's warning seriously, because if we are complacent with our lives, with the truth of the gospel, then we can easily fall prey to false teachings. Notice too that this is an instruction to a community. We are not very good at watching our own heart. We have a way of convincing ourselves that breaking the rules, bending the rules, flexing the rules is justifiable. It's like marking your own pub quiz sheet. The temptation to cheat is almost too much, isn't it? No. The instruction here is for us to watch each other for false beliefs. Not in a big brother, snitch on your neighbour for breaking lockdown kind of a way, but in a way that means that we're all working together for each other's good, each looking out for the health and well-being of our brothers and sisters. A bit like how in the beginning of lockdown 1, lots of streets started to care for each other, set up a street WhatsApp group and put notes through each other's doors, and if somebody was going to the chemist or the supermarket, they'd check in with an elderly neighbour to see if they needed anything. That's how we need to watch ourselves. That's why we take time in our membership and baptism preparation to look at these scriptures over a few weeks, to help people joining the church to see how our community should behave. As Graham keeps reminding me, there is a devastating quote in the book The Compelling Community by Mark Dever and Jamie Dunlop. Devastating in its powerfulness and in its implications, and it's this: when we commit to a local church, we hand to other believers the authority to instruct us on how we should live our lives, but not in an authoritarian way, in a caring way. Verse 9 hammers this contract home, and it leaves us in no doubt whatsoever. If we fail to remain in the truth, the spiritual consequences for us will be nothing short of devastating. We need to hold on to and to continually proclaim the unchanging truth of God in Christ as the ultimate reality. And we need to help each other do this, and we need to do it corporately. This is hard in a world where positions on such matters as sexuality and marriage are changing so rapidly, both outside and inside the established church. Our responsibility is to discover the biblical perpendicular and to judge both the old and the new by its unchanging truth. To desert the doctrine of Christ is not progress, but apostasy. To run ahead of what the Bible teaches about Jesus is not clever and modern, but good old-fashioned apostasy. And the opposite is true, that those who do believe the doctrine of Christ, well, they enjoy a living spiritual fellowship with both the Father and the Son, because the Son is the revelation of the Father to us. And so we are to call out those who teach such falsehoods rather than pretend everything is all right. In verses 10 and 11, John's instructions not to give hospitality to the false teachers, well, that doesn't sound that harsh to us, does it? No, I'm sorry, you can't come and have a meal with me, but you didn't expect to anyway, did you? That doesn't sound harsh. But in the culture of the Middle East, this was dynamite, this instruction. In the first century Middle East, there was a community duty to host travellers from other communities. You brought much shame on your community if you failed to show hospitality to travellers from other communities. And they would snub your whole community. But John wants his friends to be discerning of false teachers and break even societal norms to prevent those falsehoods from embedding them into their lives. That's how important it is to keep the falsehood out. Is there a case for us examining who or what we accept into our lives, into our church? Might it be necessary for us also to be breaking some societal, some cultural norms so that we keep falsehood out of our lives? Or are we going to be more bothered about what people think of us? We need to be prepared to stand out as a little bit odd, to be known for having different standards than the rest of the world, different ways that we use our time and our money and our homes. If we care about truth, it will make us discerning about what we watch, where we visit, how we spend our leisure time, what we talk about. We are called to be in the world, but not of the world. Chosen for truth. Truth that unites. Truth that divides. And finally, truth in person. Truth in person. Right at the end, as he's drawing to a conclusion, John's rounding off his letter, and he mentions here in verse 12 his preference for face-to-face fellowship with his readers rather than letter writing. Now, we can surely agree with that sentiment here, because this is the first century equivalent of Zoom fatigue. Sure, when a letter or a computer screen is all you've got to cover the physical distance, it's better than nothing, but better still is physical presence, some quality time in the same space. How we miss the fellowship of that hug on a Sunday morning, or the joy of a couple of hours across a pub table together. How good will it be to share a meal table in our own homes, not the garden, when this finally ends? I hope you feel John's pang of affection here, because more painfully, we're experiencing that more painfully in our current COVID normal 2020 than ever before. There is something uniquely human about physical contact. We are embodied spiritual creatures. We are made to be in physical fellowship with each other. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. This is Advent season, when we feel the imminence of the God who is Emmanuel, God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly made a man. Even as a self-confessed introvert, I need to understand that part of the joy of the new creation is that I will share it with a great multitude that no one can number. I know we can't properly meet up yet, but like John, let's not get used to social distancing. We can tolerate it for a season, but don't let yourselves become satisfied with the compromise. And when, by God's grace, the lockdowns lift and the tiers are torn away and we're all protected by vaccines, let's fully embrace our fellowship together again, both metaphorically and literally. As Rebecca McLaughlin says in Confronting Christianity, within the Christian framework, one body unity is not just for husbands and wives, it's for everyone. Christians are not designed to work alone any more than lungs can work without a heart. It's true, whilst marriage is the only place for sexual intimacy, our other friendship relationships are designed to allow space for Jesus-centered intimacy with multiple people who will touch our hearts, our minds, and bodies in different ways. That's hard to do without us spending lots of time in each other's physical presence, in each other's lives. But as John reminds us, it's in just such relationships that our joy is made complete. Complete joy is the result of fellowship. So, look forward to 2021. So in 2 John, we've seen that God chooses us for truth and calls us to believe in truth that unites and be discerning enough to know that truth divides. All throughout, he calls us to walk in love, if possible in person. We must not have one without the other. Walking in truth without love is hardness. Walking in love but not truth is softness. Walking in both truth and love brings balance and the correct Christian practice, a body loving and working together to the glory of God. How about that as a goal for the coming week?